Okay, morning everybody. Hope we had a good evening and we're all settled for today. So, Jim Seaman. I've been in the industry 36 years in various domains. My first computer security incident, before cyber became a thing, was in 2008 with the conflict worm. So I was stationed at RAF Leman. I was the computer security specialist. And we had two networks. One was our red network, and that was our secret, top secret system. That had the full confidentiality, integrity, availability applied to it. And then we had our business as usual system. Our business as usual system got hit by the conflict worm. A very voracious worm took out every system, wiped out our network for 2 weeks. However, the tactics of the threat actors was very naive back then, and they didn't monitorize that attack. So it was successful, but they didn't make any money from it. However, that world has changed. 2011, moved into the corporate world. It was a very difficult journey for me to adjust to the corporate way of doing things. Minimal compliance, not focused on doing the right thing, just doing contractual obligations. So 2018, working for a big bank, and you may have felt this feeling of feeling like Chicken Little. So you're telling the world that the sky's fallen in, nobody's listening, and it wasn't a fun time. I used this model that I'm about to show you to change the way that the C-suite, the senior leadership team, listened to me. So rather than saying, you've got 200,000 vulnerabilities that need fixing, I added some context to it. And by adding context, I looked at the critical assets, the assets that were important to that business, and I then started looking at the threats, looking at what's happening in the industry, looking at what's happening in the world, and then applying it to my environment. And suddenly, at the monthly board meetings, instead of being the last thing on the agenda, we were the first thing on the agenda to be discussed. Okay, and you can't do that without knowing your assets. Knowing what your assets do, what they're connected to. So, this is not anything new. I worked in protective security for 22 years. We used this wisdom, which is 2,500 years old, to drive our strategy. You need to know your enemy, and you also need to know your assets that are at risk of that enemy. The enemies are changing. They're changing their tactics. We need to change our tactics to respond to the changing tactics. And a lot of that is around threat intelligence. I was at the front line in Afghanistan working in threat intelligence, looking after my assets and looking at the threats that were coming in. And the threats could be tangible and intangible. Okay, so I mentioned that the threat landscape is changing. The threat actors are changing their tactics. They're no longer the naive, conflict worm, sporadic. They're not only are they changing their tactics, they're working together. So when we saw a recent attack in the UK, the way they got in was they used the tactics of scattered spiders tactics, got them into the environment. Scattered Spider are specialists in social engineering. They are young kids, mostly English speaking, and they got their access. They're the initial access brokers. Once they got inside the network, and they got to a certain point, they then handed over to their secondary, which was Dragon Force. Dragon Force are the specialists with ransomware. They deliver ransomware as a service. So they've learned to monitorize their attacks. So once the initial access brokers find a way into the system, they'll go so far into the network, and then they'll sell that information on, or they'll work in collaboration with that second party. Dragon Force, ransomware as a service, they delivered the message to this retailer. And they said, we make your valuable systems unavailable. if your valuable systems in your business are made unavailable, you can't operate. How do you operate your valuable systems and make yourself a viable business if your systems that you're relying on are no longer there? And that's where they make their money. They extort the business through the ransomware attacks. And that's what they're looking for. Disrupt the business. They do look at finding data, but they want to monetize the data. In PCI, what do? We descope our environments. We limit the amount of data. We make the data less valuable. Last 4 digits, last 6 digits, But they also look at reputational damage. When they want to extort an organization, there was a UK nursery firm that was hit by ransomware. You wouldn't think they would attack a nursery firm. But what they did they used the data and threatened to exploit the details of those children onto the wider network. So they would sell that on. And the threat of that data will inspire the businesses or encourage the businesses to pay a ransom. If you can't operate or you want to avoid disruption, reputational or financial impact, it sometimes is tempting with desperation to pay that ransom. So there's 3 key definitions that we need to look at for asset threat alignment. And asset threat alignment, using Sun Tzu's definition, is all about knowing what your assets are. And notice in that last line, the definition finishes off with those assets that of mission concern or business concern. So PCI is very good at saying this is your scope, and we can identify those payment card channels. But what about the stuff outside of the payment card channels? What if your PCI compliance environment stays firm, but everything else gets breached? So know what your asset is, and it's an asset that's valuable to your organization. And it's not just a system. Your third-party suppliers that are providing a valuable and critical service, they're an asset. Your personnel are an asset. If they can exploit the personnel, that's a way in. And then when you're looking at the vulnerabilities, we're not just looking at vulnerabilities and looking at CVSS scores. We're looking at vulnerabilities in the wider assets. So we're looking at, is there a vulnerability with that third party? Is there a vulnerability with that person? They say that 70% of breaches are caused by human beings. Personally, I think 100% of breaches are caused by human beings. And then your threat source. How many people use the MITRE attack threat matrix? How many get threat intelligence and look at things like that? That's what you're looking for, is looking at the capabilities of your threat actors to exploit a vulnerability in one of your assets. And it's basic risk management. And there's 2 sources. So they're not definitions I've made up, they're the official sources. Okay, so why asset threat management? Working for this large UK high street bank, they'd just gone through an acquisition and merger, and I was head of risk, and I was asked to look at the strategy that was being created by the bank that was acquiring the bank that I was working for. Their strategy had nothing in their environment to talk about their critical infrastructure. So they had nothing to say, we're going to spend all this money, we're going to have all these metrics that are created. There was no context behind it. So my first question said, what are you trying to protect? Don't try and do everything. Focus on the things that are important to the business. Your crown jewels. So if you don't know where your crown jewels are, how can you protect them? Okay, and criminals, they will spend time looking at your organization. Before they launch their attack, before you know about the attack, they know what your business is worth. Have you ever thought why these criminals who are launching ransomware attacks, how they come up with the figures for their ransomware? They know how much value those assets that they're about to compromise is worth to your business. They know how much money is in your business. They spend a lot of time in your networks before they launch the attack doing hostile reconnaissance. By mapping your threats to your assets and looking at the capabilities of the threat actors, and the threat actors are changing their tactics. They are sharing their specialist skills. So if they can't get into a system vulnerability, they'll get into a person vulnerability. They may not have those skill sets to do that, so they'll outsource to another threat actor who has that specialist skill set. So understanding what your crown jewels are, where they sit, and what their vulnerabilities are is a key part of your mitigation strategy. I see this a lot. You go into an organization who want to do the right thing, and they try and focus on doing everything. They try to fix every hole they've got in their organization. Lesson from PCI. Know your scope, define your scope, and focus your efforts. It's virtually impossible to safeguard an entire network. Think that you will get breached, and then allow some bits to be vulnerable and focus on the stuff that's most important. And by prioritizing through asset threat alignment, it will help you to better understand and better focus your efforts. Security is not a cheap thing. Security is one of those things that costs the business a lot. It's virtually invisible, very expensive, until it goes wrong. Then it becomes highly visible and even more expensive. So by being able to focus, you can make better uses of your resources. Do you understand what your mission-critical operations are? When you're doing your KRIs, have you aligned them to your mission-critical environments? Do your KRIs answer the so what question? Do you go to those senior leadership and say, this is what you've got at risk, this is the value to the business? If you can't answer the so what question with your KRIs are ineffective. Okay, so let's have a look at a case study. Retail organization in the UK. In May, got hit by a ransomware attack. They first got compromised in February. They didn't actually find out about it until April. And then it hit the news in the May. So they sat on the network for a good month and a half, just observing. They were quiet. They were looking at the abnormal. They were trying to mix in with the organization. And they sat there until they knew exactly what to hit. And then they launched the attack. They hit e-commerce, payments, and the logistics systems. As a retailer, if your customers can't make a payment, it might be secure, but they cannot make a payment because those systems are made unavailable, it's going to impact the business. So if you can then hit the logistics, so you can't get your supplies in, even if you were taking payments, and you were making payments in the stores, if you can't get the goods to the stores for them to pay in cash because our card machines are out of order, it has a massive impact on the business. And this was huge. And this was a dual attack. This was Scattered Spider and Dragon Force coming together to exploit that. And they made a lot of money off that organization. Because through extortion, if the business didn't pay the ransom, it cost them a lot in the fix. And backups are only good if your data gets compromised. If your systems are compromised and you've got unavailability, you have to start from scratch and rebuild everything from scratch. In that attack, the only thing that was compromised PCI-wise, last 4 digits of your card data. Do we care about last 4 digits of card data? Criminals can't do anything with it. So they're moving away from card data and looking at the systems that support the card payment channels. So have a look at the attack chain. And this is a comparison of how I could work out between the stuff that's reported and what was actually happening. So when you look at the tactics of Scattered Spider and Dragon Force, Scattered Spider are social engineering specialists. Dragon Force are systems exploitation specialists. So what they looked at doing is Scattered Spiders, as I mentioned, got them the initial access. Scattered Spider did the persistence piece of the kill chain. And this is only a handful of the steps in the kill chain. Credential access was still Scattered Spider. It was their tactics up until stage 3. Then they handed over to Dragon Force. Now, you can see the similarities in the lateral movement piece, where it was good to use Dragon Force's specializations. So they worked through and they shared that kill chain. And then finally, Dragon Force used their ransomware. They'd seen where the ransomware would be the most effective, and they applied the ransomware at that point. So we need to change our thinking. Instead of being systems-focused, learn the lessons of the ransomware attacks, where they're exploiting people. Scattered Spider are prolific at the minute. They are exploiting people. They're doing SIM swap attacks. They're looking at your access control. They're looking at the password reset. And they're exploiting people, not the technical defenses. During the retailers attack, no IT system vulnerabilities were exploited. That's not how they got into the environments. Their perimeter defenses held. They exploited people. They looked at the IT help desk, third party, and that's how they got their access in. They got a password reset. They'd compromised a user's phone. They'd done a SIM swap attack. They compromised the MFA, and they were inside. So the third-party suppliers became their access venue. So your asset inventories should not be limited to just your systems. Include your people. Include your partners, your processes. It's not just technology. So your assets should be quite varied and should cover a myriad of different aspects. This retailer, if they'd have looked under each stone and looked at their environment, they would have identified these assets as being their critical assets. They would have ring-fenced them, they would have safeguarded them, and they would have stopped those third-party or those attackers from compromising. There was almost an apathy to access management because it wasn't PCI, it wasn't robust. Nobody's going to attack a retailer. What's the profit in it? Well, clearly there is a profit in it for the criminals. So your governance must look at the wider picture. Link it to your mission statement of your business. Look at what the business is interested in, and engage with your key personnel in your business to ask them what is of interest to them. Ask them if that system or that person or that process is made unavailable, what would be the impact on the business? I spoke briefly about the dwell time. This is the time they spend inside your network clandestinely doing the reconnaissance. They spend a lot of time in your network without you knowing about it. It's like being burgled and not knowing a burglar's in your house. 8 to 10 weeks they sat inside without being identified. They will mimic normal activity. When you actually detect the abnormal activity, the horse is gone. You're bolting the gate after the horse is gone. So when they're in there, that's the stages they're going through. They're looking at, can they compromise internal accounts? Can they look at your firewalls and compromise an internal firewall that hasn't had its password reset? So all of these are limited to you as an individual. We need to defend from that. So there's the news article. So in the news article, it calls out no card data was compromised. PCI, we're very good at it. We limit the scope. We limit the amount of data. They can't monetize card data, so they look at other things. And that's where the asset threat alignment comes in. We need to change things. We need to look at our wider business. Learn from PCI and start applying it to other parts of the business. Segment your network. So if they do get compromised, think you are going to get breached, you can stop the things from happening. And the attacks are going to continue. 2025, we've had more attacks, ransomware, than ever on record. The criminals are making money from it. So it will continue. And that is me finished. Thank you very much.